July 14th, 1943. Tokyo, 2:47 in the morning. Captain Takeo Yoshikawa held an envelope in his hands. He had submitted it 2 days earlier, sealed, 46 pages inside, 8 months of work reduced to statistical tables, production graphs, and 3 pages of conclusions that he had rewritten 7 times, searching for the most neutral possible language. The envelope had traveled up through Colonel Nakano to the Strategic Assessment Division. Someone had opened it. Someone had read it. And now it had returned. Yoshikawa unsealed the envelope for the second time. The report looked exactly as he had left it. Same pages, same binding, same title across the top of the first page in his precise handwriting. Material Assessment of Relative Industrial Capacity and Strategic Implications for Extended Pacific Conflict. Except now, there was something else. Written across the title page in red ink. 1 sentence, 18 words. Inappropriate pessimism undermines fighting spirit. Discontinue further analysis along this line. Below the sentence, a signature. A general whose name Yoshikawa recognized, but whom he had never met. He read the sentence again, then a third time. The red ink looked fresh. Someone had written this within the last few hours. Someone had read his 46 pages, examined his 32 statistical tables, studied his 14 graphs showing the widening gap between American and Japanese industrial production, absorbed his conclusion that continuation of the war would result in between 1.2 and 2.8 million Japanese casualties, and reduced their response to 18 words. Inappropriate pessimism undermines fighting spirit. Yoshikawa stood in the basement cipher room of Imperial General Staff Headquarters at Ichigaya, holding the envelope, reading those 18 words, and understanding with absolute clarity that the mathematical truth he had documented so carefully for 8 months had just been classified as a threat to morale. He placed the report back in the envelope. Then he walked to his desk, unlocked the center drawer, and filed the envelope inside. He locked the drawer. He returned to his workstation. 6 other cryptanalysts sat at nearby desks, processing overnight intercepts from Pacific listening posts. None of them looked up. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and paper dust. A single desk lamp cast shadows across walls lined with filing cabinets containing 7 years of decrypted enemy communications. Yoshikawa opened the top folder in his inbox. 12 new intercepts from Rabaul. He began processing them according to standard procedure. The report in his desk drawer had taken 247 days to compile. He had started in November 1942, 3 weeks after the American invasion of Guadalcanal. His commanding officer, Colonel Nakano, had assigned him a project with no deadline and no specific parameters. Collect all available intelligence on American industrial capacity and prepare a comprehensive assessment. Yoshikawa was not a codebreaker. He lacked the intuition for it, the pattern recognition, the creative leaps required to crack enemy ciphers. What he possessed was precision in statistical analysis. While others decrypted messages, Yoshikawa compiled data. He tracked production figures, he calculated ratios, he projected trends. For 7 years, since graduating from Tokyo Imperial University with a degree in mathematics, he had worked in the Second Bureau turning raw intelligence into usable numbers. The American production assessment had started as routine work. Intercept a message about shipyard output, log the data, file the report. But somewhere around January 1943, after 3 months of compilation, Yoshikawa had noticed something in the numbers that disturbed him. The gap was widening. In 1942, American shipyards had produced 12 aircraft carriers. Japanese shipyards had produced 4, a 3-to-1 ratio. Unfavorable but not catastrophic. But the intercepts for early 1943 showed something different. American production was accelerating. new shipyards coming online, assembly line methods being applied to warship construction. By March, Yoshikawa's projections indicated American carrier production for 1943 would reach 48 vessels. Japanese production for the same period, 6 vessels, an 8-to-1 ratio. He had verified the numbers 3 times, assuming he had made an error. The numbers held. He cross-referenced them with intelligence reports from other sources. They matched. He checked his projection methodology. It was sound. Then he had expanded the analysis beyond carriers, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, transport ships. The pattern repeated across every category. American industrial output was not just larger than Japanese output, it was growing faster. Japan was fighting a war economy that produced military equipment at 8 times Japanese capacity, and was increasing that capacity every quarter. In April, Yoshikawa had begun calculating what this meant strategically. He built a mathematical model. Input: current force levels and production rates for both nations. Variable: attrition rates from ongoing combat operations. Output: projected force balance over time. The model indicated that by early 1945, American naval and air superiority across the Pacific would become absolute. Japanese defensive capacity would collapse not because of tactical failures, but because losses could not be replaced. Trained pilots killed in combat could not be replaced at sufficient rates. Ships sunk could not be rebuilt fast enough. Oil tankers destroyed meant fuel supplies for remaining ships would be exhausted. He had run the model forward to mid-1945. It projected either invasion of the home islands or systematic aerial destruction of every major Japanese city. Estimated casualties from continued operations through that point, between 1.2 and 2.8 million Japanese military and civilian dead. Then, Yoshikawa had calculated an alternative. If Japan negotiated surrender in summer 1943 while still holding significant territory, while the Imperial Navy still possessed a credible fleet, while American casualties remained relatively low, what terms might be possible? Estimated casualties from immediate cessation, approximately 180,000 to 240,000, primarily from operations already in progress. The difference between the two scenarios was roughly 1.8 million lives. He had written the conclusions without emotion. He had presented them as mathematical problems. He had included no recommendations. He had simply documented what the data indicated. On July 12th, he had sealed the report and submitted it. On July 14th, at 2:47 in the morning, it had returned with 18 words in red ink. Yoshikawa sat at his desk processing intercepts from Rabaul. At 4:30, he logged the batch into the master registry. At 5 US, he began preliminary analysis on a new set of communications from Truck. At 6:15, when the day shift began arriving, he gathered his materials and prepared to leave. Before departing, he unlocked his desk drawer and removed 3 pages from the report. Pages 43 through 45. The casualty projections. He folded them carefully and placed them in his jacket pocket. Then he locked the drawer and walked up the stairs into morning light. Tokyo was waking. Commuters filled the streets. Shopkeepers opened their stores. The city looked exactly as it had the previous morning. Yoshikawa boarded the 6:40 tram to Shinjuku and sat by the window. In his pocket, 3 folded pages contained calculations indicating that 1.8 million Japanese would die because someone had decided his analysis constituted inappropriate pessimism. He rode the tram to Shinjuku, transferred to another line, and rode back to Ichigaya. He arrived at 7:52. His shift began at 8. He was always early. At 9:15, a courier delivered a new batch of intercepts from the naval listening post at Ominato. Yoshikawa opened the folder. The top intercept was a message transmitted from Pearl Harbor to a supply depot in San Francisco. It contained a production update. 6 additional fleet carriers had entered construction at American shipyards. Projected completion, early 1944. Yoshikawa read the intercept twice. Then he opened his logbook and made a notation under American naval construction, Quarter 3, 1943. He added the 6 carriers to his running tally. The new total confirmed his projections from the rejected report. The gap was widening exactly as his model had predicted. He filed the intercept in the designated cabinet. Then he returned to his desk and picked up the next document in the queue. His hands did not shake. His expression did not change. To anyone watching, he appeared to be doing exactly what he had done every morning for 7 years. Processing intelligence, logging data, filing reports. But something had shifted. The 3 folded pages in his jacket pocket contained calculations, showing that every day the war continued moved Japan closer to the upper range of his casualty projection. 1.2 million dead if operations concluded by spring 1945, 2.8 million if they continued into summer, and now he knew that the system had no mechanism for processing this information. The truth had been submitted, reviewed, and classified as inappropriate. Yoshikawa picked up the next intercept. It reported increased B-24 production at an aircraft plant in Michigan. He logged the information into the tracking system. He filed the document. He reached for the next one. This was what happened when the mathematics of defeat encountered an institution that could not acknowledge defeat. The numbers continued. The tracking continued. The analysis continued. And no one above the basement cipher room wanted to see what the numbers said. At 11:30, Colonel Nakano entered the cipher room and stopped at Yoshikawa's desk. He did not mention the report. He simply asked if the overnight intercepts from the Central Pacific had been processed. Yoshikawa confirmed they had. Nakano nodded and departed. At 13, Yoshikawa took his lunch break. He walked to a small restaurant 3 blocks from headquarters. He ordered rice and pickled vegetables. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Then he returned to Ichigaya and resumed work. At 17, his shift ended. He filed his daily log, secured his work materials, and locked his desk. As he was preparing to leave, another courier arrived with an urgent intercept from Rabaul. American forces had landed on New Georgia. Initial reports indicated 2 divisions, supported by carrier aircraft. Yoshikawa accepted the intercept and began processing it. The analysis took 40 minutes. By the time he finished, it was 18:20. The cipher room was nearly empty. Most of the day shift had departed. Only 2 other analysts remained, working late on priority tasking. Yoshikawa logged the New Georgia intercept and filed it. Then he walked to his desk, unlocked the drawer, and looked at the envelope containing his report. Inappropriate pessimism undermines fighting spirit. Discontinue further analysis along this line. He closed the drawer, locked it, walked up the stairs and out into evening air. On the street outside Ichigaya headquarters, Tokyo continued its routines. People walked home from work. Vendors sold evening newspapers. Children played in the last light before darkness. And in the basement cipher room, locked in a desk drawer, 46 pages documented with mathematical precision that all of this would end in fire unless someone with authority decided that truth mattered more than fighting spirit. Yoshikawa walked to the tram stop and waited for the next car heading west. When it arrived, he boarded and found a seat. The tram moved through the city as daylight faded. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, watching Tokyo pass outside the window. In his jacket pocket, 3 folded pages contained numbers: 1.2 million, 2.8 million, 1.8 million difference. The tram continued west. Yoshikawa sat motionless, and somewhere in his mind a calculation began that would never be completed. If he remained silent, if he continued processing intercepts without protest, if he allowed the system to function as it had decided to function, how many of those 1.8 million deaths would be his responsibility? He did not know the answer, but he understood with absolute clarity that starting tomorrow morning, he would return to the cipher room, unlock his desk, process the overnight intercepts, and continue tracking the industrial production data that no one wanted to acknowledge. The mathematics would continue. The truth would continue accumulating in filing cabinets, and he would be the man who knew what it meant and said nothing. January 1944. The intercepts continued arriving. Every morning, couriers delivered folders containing overnight communications from Pacific listening posts. Yoshikawa processed them with the same precision he had maintained for 8 years. He logged ship movements. He tracked production figures. He filed reports. The numbers confirmed everything his rejected assessment had predicted. By March 1944, American carrier strength in the Pacific had reached 53 vessels. Japanese carrier strength stood at 9. The 8-to-1 production ratio from his July 1943 report had become a 6-to-1 operational ratio. The gap was no longer widening. It had become a chasm. Yoshikawa documented this in his personal tracking logs. He maintained meticulous records, updating his statistical tables each week. The data accumulated in a separate folder he kept in his locked desk drawer, filed behind the rejected report. No one had asked him to continue this analysis. No one knew he was doing it. But he could not stop. The mathematics demanded completion. On March 23rd, Colonel Nakano entered the cipher room carrying a directive from Strategic Assessment Division. New priority tasking. All analysts were to focus intelligence collection on American logistics and supply chain vulnerabilities. The directive specified that reports should emphasize weaknesses and exploitable gaps in enemy operations. Yoshikawa read the directive twice. It contained no mention of tracking American production capacity, no mention of comparative force analysis, no mention of strategic sustainability assessments. The institution had decided what kind of intelligence it wanted. Information that supported continued operations. Information that identified targets. Information that maintained fighting spirit. He filed the directive in his desk and resumed processing overnight intercepts. That afternoon, an intercept arrived from Truk. American submarines had sunk 3 Japanese oil tankers in the South China Sea. Total tonnage lost, 42,000 tons. Yoshikawa logged the information and cross-referenced it with his running tally of merchant shipping losses. Since January 1st, Japan had lost 97 merchant vessels. Replacement construction during the same period, 14 vessels. The mathematics were simple. Japan was losing its merchant fleet 7 times faster than it could rebuild. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies were declining every month. By his calculations, fuel supplies for the combined fleet would reach critical levels by autumn 1944. He documented this in his personal logs. Then he filed the intercept and moved to the next document. In June 1944, American forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The battle lasted 3 weeks. Japanese defensive forces, approximately 30,000 troops, were annihilated. American casualties were significant but sustainable. Japanese losses were total. Yoshikawa received the intelligence reports as they arrived. Intercepts from American communications. Reports from Japanese commanders on Saipan before the final collapse. The usual post-battle assessments from Strategic Division. On June 27th, he overheard 2 analysts discussing the Marianas campaign during lunch break. One of them described it as a temporary setback. He said American forces had overextended their supply lines. He predicted a successful counteroffensive would retake the islands within 6 months. Yoshikawa said nothing. He finished his rice and returned to the cipher room. The loss of Saipan meant American B-29 bombers could now reach Tokyo. This was not speculation, it was geometry. The Marianas lay 1/500 miles from the Japanese home islands, well within B-29 range. Yoshikawa had calculated this in his July 1943 report, in the section projecting strategic consequences of continued American advances. Page 38. He had estimated that once American forces secured airfields within bomber range of Japan, systematic aerial bombardment of Japanese cities would commence within 3 to 6 months. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29 bombers launched from Saipan and attacked Tokyo. They targeted the Musashino aircraft engine plant. The raid caused moderate damage and killed approximately 700 civilians. Yoshikawa was in the cipher room when the air raid siren sounded. He remained at his desk, continuing to process intercepts. The basement walls were thick. He heard nothing except the distant vibration of anti-aircraft guns. After 2 hours, the all-clear sounded. He completed his shift and walked home through streets filled with fire trucks and debris. His house in Shinjuku was undamaged. His wife and 2 sons were safe. They ate dinner without discussing the raid. There was nothing to discuss. Everyone in Tokyo understood what the appearance of American bombers meant. The war had reached the home islands. That night, Yoshikawa removed the 3 folded pages from his jacket pocket, the casualty projections from his rejected report. He had carried them for 16 months. The paper had become soft from handling. The creases were beginning to tear. He unfolded the pages carefully and read the numbers again. Estimated casualties from continued operations through mid-1945, 1.2 to 2.8 million. The first B-29 raid had killed 700. His projection model indicated this was the beginning. As American bomber numbers increased, as targeting became more effective, as defenses deteriorated, casualties would escalate. The mathematics were clear. He refolded the pages and returned them to his pocket. In October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining carrier strength to a desperate offensive in the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf lasted 4 days. When it ended, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships destroyed, 10 cruisers lost. The combined fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants incapable of coordinated operations. Yoshikawa received the official casualty reports on October 27th. Imperial General Headquarters published a communiqué claiming a great victory. Enemy losses were listed as 11 aircraft carriers sunk, 2 battleships destroyed, numerous cruiser and destroyer losses. The communiqué described the battle as a decisive defeat of American naval power. 3 days later, Yoshikawa processed an intercept from Pearl Harbor. It was a routine logistics message updating repair schedules for damaged vessels. The intercept listed American losses from Leyte Gulf: 1 light carrier sunk, 2 escort carriers damaged, 3 destroyers lost. He read the intercept 3 times. Then he filed it in the designated cabinet without comment. The official communiqué remained unchanged. Strategic Assessment Division circulated analyses praising the victory at Leyte Gulf. Planning documents referenced the destruction of American carrier forces and discussed how this would affect future operations. No one mentioned the intercept data. No one asked Yoshikawa to reconcile the official reports with the signal's intelligence. The institution had decided what the battle meant. The mathematics were irrelevant. On the evening of October 30th, Yoshikawa sat in his small office at home, updating his personal tracking logs. He calculated actual Japanese losses at Leyte Gulf based on intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and post-battle communications. Then he compared these figures to the official communiqué. The discrepancy was not an error. It was not an intelligence failure. It was institutional self-deception, functioning as operational doctrine. He closed his logbook and returned it to the locked drawer in his desk. December 1944. American B-29 raids on Tokyo intensified. The bombers came every week, sometimes twice weekly. They targeted industrial facilities, rail yards, port infrastructure. Casualties increased with each raid. 800 killed, 1,000 killed, 1,500 killed. Yoshikawa continued processing intercepts. The intelligence reports showed American bomber production increasing every month. By December, the United States was producing more B-29 aircraft in a single month than Japan had produced heavy bombers during the entire war. He documented this. He filed it. He said nothing. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The raid created firestorms that destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Official casualty figures reported 88,000 dead, 41,000 injured, over 1 million homeless. Yoshikawa was working the night shift when the raid began. He remained in the cipher room processing intercepts while the city burned above him. When he emerged at dawn, Tokyo was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The air smelled of ash and burned wood, and something else he could not identify and did not want to name. He walked toward Shinjuku through streets filled with debris and bodies covered with sheets. Fire crews worked to contain blazes that still burned. Medical teams carried wounded on stretchers. People wandered through ruins searching for family members. When Yoshikawa reached his neighborhood, he found that his house no longer existed. The entire block had burned. Nothing remained except foundation stones and twisted metal. Neighbors were gathered at the end of the street. A woman he recognized pointed toward the ruins and told him his wife and younger son had been inside when the fires started. They had not escaped. Yoshikawa stood looking at the place where his house had been. Smoke still rose from the debris. His older son had been conscripted into the army 6 months earlier and was stationed somewhere in Manchuria. His wife and younger son were dead. He had no home. He stood there for 11 minutes. Then he walked to the tram station and waited for the first car running toward Ichigaya. When it arrived, he boarded and rode to headquarters. He arrived at the cipher room at 0940. His shift had ended at 080, but there was nowhere else to go. Colonel Nakano found him at his desk processing intercepts. Nakano asked if Yoshikawa needed emergency leave. Yoshikawa said he did not. Nakano hesitated, then nodded and departed. Yoshikawa continued working. His hands moved through the routine without thought. Open folder, read intercept, log data, file document, repeat. That night, he slept on a cot in the basement storage room. Headquarters had emergency accommodations for staff who had lost housing in the raids. Yoshikawa requested a space and was assigned a corner near the boiler room. He brought no possessions because he had no possessions. Everything had burned. In the following weeks, the B-29 raids continued. American bombers systematically destroyed Japanese cities: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. The casualty figures accumulated. Yoshikawa processed intelligence reports documenting the raids. He tracked bomber numbers, targeting patterns, casualty estimates. The numbers in his March 1945 tracking logs exceeded the lower range of his casualty projection from July 1943. Japan had now suffered 1.2 million military and civilian dead. The war was continuing. The upper range of his projection, 2.8 million casualties by mid-1945, was becoming increasingly probable. He sat in the basement cipher room processing intercepts while American bombers reduced Japanese cities to ash. And in his locked desk drawer, a report written 21 months earlier documented with mathematical precision that all of this had been predictable, preventable, and would continue until either surrender or total destruction. On August 15, 1945, at noon, Emperor Hirohito's voice broadcast over radio announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration terms. Unconditional surrender. The war was over. Yoshikawa listened to the broadcast in the cipher room. Around him, analysts wept. Some sat motionless, faces empty of expression. Colonel Nakano stood by the door, back rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. Yoshikawa felt nothing. He had spent 25 months processing intelligence that documented Japan's mathematical progression toward this exact outcome. The surprise was not that surrender had come. The surprise was that it had taken so long. When the broadcast ended, silence filled the cipher room. No one moved, no one spoke. Then slowly, people began leaving. Some to find family. Some simply to walk out of the building into a world that no longer made sense. Yoshikawa remained at his desk. After 20 minutes, he was alone. He sat perfectly still, looking at the stack of unprocessed intercepts that had arrived that morning. They were now meaningless. There would be no more enemy communications to decrypt, no more production figures to track, no more intelligence to analyze. He unlocked his desk drawer and removed the folder containing his personal tracking logs. 25 months of data. Every projection from his July 1943 report had been confirmed. The production ratios, the force imbalances, the casualty estimates. All of it documented, filed, and ignored. Final Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would eventually be calculated at approximately 2.6 million dead. Well within his projected range. The mathematics had been correct. He opened the folder and looked at the first page. His handwriting from July 1943, neat columns of numbers. Then he closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. He locked the drawer. He stood, put on his jacket, and walked up the stairs into afternoon sunlight. Tokyo was silent. No air raid sirens, no anti-aircraft fire, no bombers, just silence. People moved through the streets slowly, as if uncertain the war had truly ended, as if expecting one final raid to shatter the peace. Yoshikawa walked without direction. He had no home to return to, no family waiting, no purpose. He walked until evening, then returned to headquarters and slept on the cot in the storage room. The next morning, American occupation forces would begin arriving. The Second Bureau would be dissolved. The cipher room would be emptied, its files confiscated. And somewhere in those files, locked in a desk drawer, a 46-page report written 25 months earlier would document the exact mathematical path Japan had followed to surrender. But that discovery would come later. On the evening of August 15, 1945, Yoshikawa lay on a cot in a basement storage room and calculated in his mind the number he had avoided calculating for 25 months, 1.8 million. The difference between his low-end and high-end projections, the number of Japanese who might have survived if someone with authority had read his report in July 1943 and believed the mathematics instead of dismissing them as inappropriate pessimism. He did not know if any of those 1.8 million included his wife and younger son. The mathematics could not answer that question. But he understood with absolute clarity that he had continued working, processing intercepts, tracking data, documenting the progression toward catastrophe for 25 months without protest, without refusal, without speaking the truth that no one wanted to hear. And that silence had become its own form of complicity. September 3, 1945. American military police arrived at Imperial General Staff Headquarters at Ichigaya at 09 Haisensro. They carried lists of names, officers and analysts to be detained for interrogation. Yoshikawa's name appeared on the second page. He was sitting at his desk in the cipher room when two MPs entered. They asked for Captain Takeo Yoshikawa. He identified himself. They instructed him to gather his personal effects and accompany them. He had no personal effects. Everything had burned in March. He stood, put on his jacket, and followed them upstairs. The Americans had established a temporary detention facility in the former officer barracks. Yoshikawa was processed, photographed, and assigned to a holding cell with 11 other intelligence personnel. No one spoke. They sat on bunks waiting for interrogation schedules that no one had explained. On September 7th, Yoshikawa was escorted to an interrogation room. An American major sat behind a desk. A Japanese civilian translator stood beside him. The major asked Yoshikawa to describe his duties at Second Bureau. Yoshikawa explained his role: cryptanalysis, statistical analysis, intelligence compilation. The major made notes. Then he asked if Yoshikawa had produced any strategic assessments during his service. Yoshikawa hesitated. Then he said yes. One assessment. July 1943. Material capacity analysis with casualty projections. The major looked up. He asked if this assessment still existed. Yoshikawa said it should be filed in his desk at Second Bureau headquarters. The major made a note and dismissed him. 2 days later, Yoshikawa was returned to the interrogation room. The major sat behind the desk. Next to him, a folder, 46 pages. Yoshikawa recognized it immediately. The major opened the folder and began reading sections aloud while the translator converted his English into Japanese. Production ratios, force projections, casualty estimates. When he reached page 43, he stopped and looked at Yoshikawa. "You wrote this in July 1943. The major's voice was neutral, stating fact. "You predicted Japanese casualties of 1.2 to 2.8 million if the war continued through 1945. Final Japanese casualties were approximately 2.6 million. Your projection was accurate within 4%. Yoshikawa said nothing. The major continued. "This report was submitted to your superiors in July 1943. It was rejected. You were ordered to discontinue this analysis." He paused. Then he asked, "Did you continue tracking these projections after the report was rejected?" "Yes," Yoshikawa said. "Did you inform anyone that the casualty projections were being confirmed by ongoing events?" "No. Why not?" "Because I was ordered to discontinue the analysis. Because the system had classified the information as inappropriate. Because speaking would have accomplished nothing except my own arrest." The major studied him for several seconds. Then he closed the folder. He said, "You will not be charged with war crimes. Your assessment demonstrates that you understood Japan's strategic situation accurately. However, we need to verify certain technical details in your report. You will remain in detention while we complete this review." Yoshikawa was returned to his cell. 3 weeks later, on September 28th, he was summoned again. Different interrogation room, different officer, an American colonel, older, with intelligence corps insignia. No translator this time. The colonel spoke Japanese, fluently, with a Kansai accent that suggested years of residence in Osaka or Kyoto. The colonel introduced himself as an analyst with Strategic Bombing Survey. He said, "We have reviewed your July 1943 assessment. Your methodology is sound. Your conclusions were correct." He paused. "We want to offer you a position." Yoshikawa did not understand. He asked what kind of position. The colonel explained. American occupation authorities were establishing a new intelligence structure for Japan. Democratic oversight, civilian control, analytical independence. They needed Japanese personnel who understood intelligence work but were not contaminated by Imperial General Staff doctrine. Personnel who could think critically, who could report unwelcome truths to superiors without fear of suppression. "Your assessment demonstrates you possess these qualities," the colonel said. We want you to help build this new system." Yoshikawa sat silently. Then he asked, "You want me to work for the occupation?" "We want you to work for Japan's future government," the colonel corrected. "Under occupation oversight initially, but eventually transitioning to full Japanese autonomy." He leaned forward. "Captain Yoshikawa, you wrote a report that could have saved 1.8 million lives if anyone had listened. We are offering you the opportunity to ensure that kind of analysis never gets suppressed again." Yoshikawa looked at his hands. They were folded in his lap, exactly as they had been folded for 2 years while processing intercepts, while tracking casualties while remaining silent. He thought about the locked desk drawer, about the 46 pages that had traveled from rejection to American Intelligence Corps' evaluation, about the question he had been calculating for 25 months and could not answer. He said, "I accept." The work began in October 1945. Yoshikawa was assigned to a joint American-Japanese team developing procedures for the new Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office. His role was technical advisor for analytical methodology. He reviewed proposed intelligence collection priorities. He designed reporting templates. He wrote training materials teaching young Japanese analysts how to present unwelcome assessments to superiors. The irony consumed him slowly. He spent his days teaching others to do what he had failed to do. Speak truth to power. Refuse institutional pressure to modify conclusions. Maintain analytical integrity regardless of political consequences. The young analysts listened carefully. They took notes. They asked thoughtful questions about how to balance accuracy with institutional loyalty. Yoshikawa answered their questions using examples from American intelligence doctrine, never mentioning his own history. None of them knew about the July 1943 report. None of them knew he had spent 25 months documenting catastrophe while remaining silent. In 1947, Yoshikawa was promoted to section chief for strategic analysis. In 1950, as American Occupation Authority gradually transferred to Japanese civilian control, he became Deputy Director of Analytical Services. He supervised 43 analysts producing assessments on regional security, economic development, domestic stability. Every report underwent review to ensure conclusions were supported by evidence, that assessments remained objective, that institutional bias did not corrupt analysis. He was exceptionally good at this work, perhaps better than anyone in the new intelligence service, because he understood with absolute clarity what happened when institutions suppressed truth. He had watched it happen. He had participated in it, and he had counted the cost in the ruins of his burned house, in the silence of his empty apartment, in the letters he received and did not answer. In 1952, his older son wrote from Sapporo. The son had survived the war as a conscript in Manchuria, returned to Japan in 1946, and was now studying engineering at Hokkaido University on scholarship. The letter was brief and formal. He asked if they could meet. He said he understood if his father was too busy. He said he simply wanted to see him once. Yoshikawa read the letter 4 times. Then he wrote a reply, 3 sentences. He explained that his work kept him in Tokyo. He said he was proud of his son's academic success. He enclosed money for living expenses and textbooks. He did not explain why he could not meet. He could not explain that every time he thought about his son, he thought about his wife and younger son who had burned in March 1945. And he thought about the calculation he had made in July 1943, the one that indicated they would still be alive if someone had read 46 pages and believed the mathematics instead of dismissing them as inappropriate pessimism. His son wrote again 6 months later, same question. Could they meet? Yoshikawa sent money in another brief letter declining. The correspondence continued for 3 years. Letters arriving every 6 months. Money sent in return. no meetings. In 1955, the letters stopped. His son had graduated, found employment, married. The connection dissolved into institutional arrangements. Yoshikawa continued sending money twice yearly to an address in Sapporo. No letters accompanied the transfers. Every evening, Yoshikawa returned to his small apartment in Koenji. The apartment contained a desk, a futon, a small bookshelf. On the desk sat a locked drawer. Inside the drawer, two items: the original copy of his July 1943 report and 25 months of personal tracking logs documenting how his projections had been confirmed with 4% accuracy. He never opened the drawer except on specific dates. March 10th, the anniversary of the Tokyo firestorm. August 15th, the anniversary of surrender. And July 14th, the anniversary of the day his report was returned with 18 words in red ink. On those dates, he would open the drawer, remove the documents, and read them completely. This is what I knew. This is when I knew it. This is what I did not say. In 1959, Yoshikawa began experiencing persistent stomach pain. He ignored it for several months. When he finally consulted a doctor, the diagnosis was advanced gastric cancer, inoperable. 6 months, possibly 12. He continued working until February 1960, when the pain became too severe to maintain the pretense of normal function. He submitted his resignation. The Director of Cabinet Intelligence accepted it with regret and arranged for a small ceremony honoring Yoshikawa's 15 years of service. Yoshikawa attended the ceremony. People made speeches praising his contributions. He listened politely and said nothing about the irony. In his final weeks, Yoshikawa opened the locked drawer more frequently, not on commemorative dates, just whenever the pain medications allowed him clarity of thought. He would remove the notebook containing his wartime tracking logs and turn to the final page, the page where he had been trying to complete the calculation for 17 years. He would sit at his desk with a pen, staring at the incomplete line. My guilt, and then a question mark. He tried various formulations, percentages, ratios, comparative analyses. None of them resolved. The mathematics that had served him for 35 years, that had allowed him to predict casualties with 4% accuracy, that had documented institutional self-deception with perfect precision, could not calculate this final number. Because guilt was not a production ratio or a casualty projection or a force balance calculation. It existed in the space between knowing a truth and speaking it, between continuing to work and refusing to work, between 25 months of processing intercepts while Tokyo burned and his family died and 1.8 million others followed. He could not quantify that space. He tried until the pain made thinking impossible. Takeo Yoshikawa died at home in Koenji on April 3, 1960, at 4:17 in the morning. His daughter, who he had not seen in 8 years, was notified by the landlord later that day. She took the train from Osaka. She had married in 1954 and had 2 young children. Her father had not attended the wedding. He had sent money and a brief formal note of congratulations. When her first child was born, she had written telling him he was a grandfather. He had sent money for the child and did not reply otherwise. She arrived at the apartment on April 4th. The landlord gave her the key. She entered alone and spent several minutes standing in the doorway, looking at the small room where her father had lived for 15 years. The futon was neatly folded. The bookshelf contained technical manuals on intelligence analysis and a few novels. The desk was empty except for a locked drawer. She found the key among his personal effects. She opened the drawer and discovered the folder in the notebook. She read for 2 hours without moving from the desk chair. When she finished, she understood something about her father that had never been explained. Why he had worked for the Americans. Why he had refused to see family. why he had spent 15 years teaching young analysts to speak truths that institutions did not want to hear. She turned to the final page of the notebook. Her father's handwriting, less steady than in the earlier entries. Recent additions. Calculations attempted and crossed out. Different formulations of the same problem. And at the bottom of the page, one line that remained unfinished. My guilt. She stared at the question mark for several minutes. Then she closed the notebook, gathered all the documents from the drawer, and carried them downstairs to the small courtyard behind the apartment building. She had brought matches. She knelt on the concrete and arranged the papers carefully. 46 pages of the July 1943 report. 25 months of tracking logs. All the documentation of what her father had known and when he had known it, and what he had done with that knowledge. She struck a match and held it to the corner of the first page. The paper caught immediately. She fed the documents into the flame slowly, watching each page curl and blacken and dissolve into ash. She did not do this from shame. She did this because she understood that her father had spent 17 years trying to answer a question that had no answer, and preserving that question would serve no purpose except to pass the impossibility to someone else. When the last page had burned, she used a stick to scatter the ashes. Then she returned upstairs, completed the arrangements with the landlord, and took the evening train back to Osaka. Her father was cremated 3 days later. The funeral was small. Colleagues from Cabinet Intelligence attended. The director gave a brief eulogy praising Yoshikawa's contributions to building Japan's postwar analytical institutions. Several younger analysts spoke about what they had learned from him. No one mentioned the war. No one mentioned a rejected report. No one mentioned 25 months of silence. After the ceremony, the director approached Yoshikawa's daughter. He said her father had been an exceptional analyst. He said the new intelligence service had been built on principles her father had helped establish. He said Japan owed him a debt for ensuring that truth would never again be suppressed by institutional convenience. She thanked him politely and said nothing else. On the train back to Osaka, she thought about the final page of the notebook, the line that ended with a question mark. She thought about her father sitting at that desk night after night for 17 years, trying to calculate something that mathematics could not measure. She thought about the question he had been asking. Not what was his guilt, but whether guilt could be calculated at all. Whether there existed a formula that could weigh knowing against speaking, silence against complicity, institutional obedience against moral responsibility. Her father had tried to find that formula. He had failed. And in failing, he had discovered something the mathematics could not tell him, that some questions exist precisely because they have no answers, that the space between knowing and speaking, between calculating and acting, between understanding catastrophe and preventing it, cannot be measured or quantified or resolved. The question mark remained, not because her father had been unable to complete the calculation, but because the calculation itself was impossible. She looked out the train window at the countryside passing in the evening light. Rice fields, villages, people walking home from work, Japan rebuilt, Japan continuing. All of it existing because certain decisions had been made, and certain truths had been spoken, and certain silences had been maintained. And somewhere in that complexity, her father had spent the last 17 years of his life trying to determine his responsibility for what had happened when he had known the truth, documented it with precision, submitted it through proper channels, and then remained silent when it was rejected. The question mark was all that remained. No answer. Just the symbol indicating that a question had been asked and no solution existed, and perhaps no solution had ever been possible. The train continued south through the darkness. In a small courtyard in Koenji, wind scattered ashes across concrete. And in Cabinet Intelligence archives, a personnel file recorded 15 years of exemplary service by a section chief who had taught an entire generation of analysts never to remain silent when they discovered uncomfortable truths. The file contained no mention of what had happened before 1945, no mention of 46 pages, no mention of the calculation that could not be completed, just a name, dates of service, and a final notation. Contributions to analytical methodology were foundational to post-war institutional development. The train reached Osaka at 23:40. Yoshikawa's daughter walked home through quiet streets, returned to her husband and children, and never spoke about what she had read in the notebook or why she had burned it. Some questions do not have answers. Some calculations cannot be completed, and some silences, once established, remain permanent, not because the truth is unknown, but because the truth exists in a place where mathematics ends and something else begins, something that cannot be measured or filed or resolved, only carried, until it can be scattered like ash in an empty courtyard and left to dissolve in wind and time and the ongoing life of a nation that had forgotten what the silence had cost.